Today we're going to talk a little bit about a problem that woodworkers have had to contend with for centuries, and that's wood movement. I like to jokingly say that the only constant in the universe is that wood moves. It moves in a number of different ways. The one that has the most long-term consequences for woodworkers is wood's reaction to changes in temperature and humidity. As the temperature and humidity changes, wood either gives up absorbed water or it absorbs more water. When the humidity is high, wood tends to absorb water and expand. When the humidity is lower, then that water evaporates and the wood shrinks. And as it changes from one to the other, wood is constantly expanding and contracting as it changes, as changes occur in temperature and humidity. Now, that effect on finished pieces can be profound. If you have assembled that particular piece poorly, if it's not glued well, if you didn't use the right kind of joint, then this constant movement will loosen glue joints and they will eventually fail, and your piece essentially falls apart. Sometimes it takes years for this to occur, but if you're building a piece that you want to last for a long time, then you must give some serious consideration to how you're going to construct the piece so you can counteract some of that movement that's going to occur. And this movement not only occurs in unfinished lumber. Even when you put a finish on wood, it does not eliminate the movement. It will reduce it somewhat, but it will not completely eliminate it. Wood moves, and there's really nothing you can do about it. The only thing that you can do is to take steps to mitigate it. And we'll talk a lot more about that in other videos when we start talking about gluing and the different types of joints. There's another kind of movement that occurs in wood that is more short-term. As a tree grows, not all of them grow straight up where the weight load from the branches is even and the tree is in balance. Then the wood grains all the way around the circumference of that tree can grow the same. But in the case of a tree in a high wind area, where the wind is blowing enough to where it's made that tree lean, or it can be planted on the side of a hill, and it's harder for the tree to stay straight up and down. There are times when disease will affect a large limb, and it will die and break off, and then all of that weight is removed from that side. That makes it unbalanced. Now, when a tree is unbalanced, the direction that it's leaning, the fibers on one side of the tree are under a lot more compression stress than the fibers on the other side of the tree, which tend to want to stretch. So this unbalance from one side of the tree to the other can cause internal stress in the tree Now, when that tree is cut down and it's harvested for lumber, that stress is still present, and it wants to bow, it wants to cup, it wants to just move in different directions. Now, in the next segment, we're going to talk about that stress from the tree, and we'll see how that affects lumber cut from a tree that was under that kind of stress. And we'll look at that in the next segment. Now, as we look at this board, let's assume that this board comes from a tree that was under the kind of stress we were talking about, where one side of the tree, the stress on it wanted to compress the fibers, and on the other side of it wanted to stretch the fibers. And this board can be under that kind of stress, even though you can't really see it. This edge on the board can be perfectly straight and parallel to the one on this side. But if I wanted to cut a section out of this board, say, 1 3/4 inches I want to cut out of here. Even though this edge is perfectly straight now, when I run that through the table saw and it comes out on the other side, it's quite possible that that 1 3/4 inch board this edge will no longer be straight. It would be bowed. Because once I took off a smaller piece of this board, that smaller piece was able to distort where the wider piece was not able to. So now I'm left with a short piece that has a bow in it. The edge is not straight. Now, if I try to use that piece in a project, it's going to cause me all kinds of trouble. And if I made that cut to exactly the width that I need for the project, and that board is now warped, then there's no way that I can correct the warpage and maintain the full width. So I'll wind up with a board that's narrower than I cut. So when I'm cutting pieces for a project, what I like to do is cut them oversized when I rip them out of a wider board. If I wanted a finished piece at 1 3/4 inches, I would cut that at 1 7/8 inches. And then when I run it through the table saw, if it does bow, then I can go to either a joiner or an edge sander, and I can true up and make that edge straight again, and then run it through the table saw a second time and cut it to my 1 3/4 inches. Then I'm sure that my piece is going to be, I'm going to have enough material to get the exact width that I want for my project, and that the sides, the edges are going to be flat and straight. And that's the way that you can compensate for a board that's going to distort once you take smaller width pieces out of it. I just call it cutting oversized. You give yourself an extra 1/8 of an inch in width, and then you have the material that you need to be able to correct it later if your piece happens to warp on you when you take it out of the wider board. Now, that's one way that you can overcome it. And the stress that we're talking about, the stress that's built into the tree, that kind of stress is shorter term. Once you take your final width out, and once you account for that and true it up, it's not going to move much again. You have essentially removed the stress from that smaller board, and it's going to stay straight. It's still going to expand and contract with the changes in temperature and humidity. But you have counteracted the stress that was built into the board while it was a tree. And then we'll look at a little bit more detail in just a moment. Okay, let's just run a little experiment. I've got a board here and I've run this edge through an edge sander, and I'm sure that's perfectly flat. It sits on the table and you can see no gap at the bottom. So it's perfectly flat. Now if we run this through the table saw at about 1.5 or 2 inches, we will see whether or not this board comes out straight. This edge is perfectly straight. That's the one I put against the fence. And we'll make the cut in. Now this was the edge that was perfectly straight before. Now if we put that down, we can actually see that there's a gap in the middle. The board has bowed just because I took it out of that wider piece. And if you had cut this to your final dimension and it had that bow in it, that's going to have a detrimental impact on your project because you're trying to use a piece of wood that's not straight. We'll take a look at what you can do about that problem in the next segment. Now, another thing to realize about this piece of wood that we've taken out of the larger piece. Now, when we made our cut, the piece bowed, and we don't have a gap at the bottom when we turn it upside down. So it is moved. So in moving, essentially the stress that was in it when it was in the larger piece is now relaxed. The wood is moved, so the stress is no longer in the piece of wood. It's been relieved when it moved. Now, when we clean up these edges, we're not going to have to worry about that. It's not going to move again. And because we have the piece so small, then we're only taking out a small amount on each edge. That's not enough to make it move again. So the stress essentially has been relieved, and now we can take this piece and trim it to our final width without any worry about it moving again. And I'll show you how you do that in the next segment. Now, there's several different ways that you can clean up that first edge. It's what I call getting one clean edge. You could put that on a joiner and take it out, or you can put it on an edge sander like this. Now, when we put it down on the flat surface again, it's now flat all the way across here. So we've established our one good edge, and we still have more width than we needed. We'll simply go back to the table saw, and we'll trim this edge parallel to this one at the exact width that we want. And then we've got a good a piece of wood that we can include in a project where we're going to have the ability to have the best possible project. Okay, we're back at the table saw, and this is the edge that we straightened up on the edge sander. And you can see this piece rocks because this side was bowed. And now we have to make this side parallel to this side. I've got the saw set up. All we have to do is just run this through, and that will make both sides parallel, both sides straight at the exact finished width that we wanted. Okay, now we've completed the cut on this side. We have them exactly the way we want it. And this is what I call cutting oversized. And it's a good method to use when you want to protect yourself against the possibility of a bow when you take a narrow piece out of a wider piece. And there'll be a number of other things that we'll talk about in other videos, but for now, that's all I have, and we'll see you next time in the next video.